Hi, I'm Eric, and I'm back with another video. It's Saturday evening here. It's about 10 p.m. And as I like to do periodically with my friend in Ukraine, who lives in a city somewhere what can I say, a city that I won't name, um, somewhere in the area of Ukraine, which is it's 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 um, it's a city somewhere in Ukraine. Let's leave it at that. And I met her in Chiang Mai a couple of years ago, and we got along really great because she's a Soviet person, and I have fun. Even though I was not born in the Soviet Union, I kind of appreciate what it's about. I was just listening to this guy. Uh, he's um, he's a Jewish person, practicing Jewish person living in Canada, and I'll be doing another post about this guy, and also with Jeffrey Sachs. Both of these guys are professors, Jewish. They're Jews who are professors, and they did a very interesting talk about the situation in Israel, what the nature of Zionism is, the relationship of Zionists to Judaism. And this guy had some very interesting things to say because he was born and raised in Leningrad. And Leningrad, of course, was the city that was decimated during World War II. A million people died of bombings and mostly starvation and cold because it was surrounded by the German and other. He said that it was surrounded by Germans, Finns, and Spanish during World War II. And, as I say, a million people died. Vladimir Putin's brother died there. And but anyway, his family, survived. His mother and father survived. He was born a year after. I think he was born like just the end of World War II. But he ended up emigrating to Canada, where he lives, and he speaks, five languages. Obviously he's 80 years old, a very, very intelligent person, and he talks about the nature of Judaism and its relationship to Zionism. But I'll leave that for another. The reason why I bring it up is because he was saying that the Soviet Union was essentially, like 80% illiterate at the time of the Russian Revolution, and Lenin, who was the first, the first leader of the Soviet Union, placed a big emphasis on getting people to be educated and to be literate. So he sent people off into the villages and got, within 10 years, illiteracy in the Soviet Union, in the Russian space, was wiped out, which is an extraordinary accomplishment. And, to be wiped out in a country that had been decimated by both a lost World War I, as well as a civil war, as well as being invaded by people, as well as being sanctioned by much of the country, much of the rest of the world that wanted it to fail. Nevertheless, they got the people educated, and as a result, it had some of the greatest scientists, and to this day, as a leader in technology. So it's really quite remarkable, and I think that the Soviet Union really needs to be accorded some credit for that. They also wiped out famines. So I think that Soviet Union has been given a really bad rap by the West. But be that as it may, I have a friend in this city in Ukraine, because Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. It was one of the constituent republics of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So they were sort of semi-autonomous, but part of the Soviet Union. And they had, Soviet culture. She was trained in a Soviet school. So we talked for about an hour today. And so I'll just kind of recount some of the things off the top of my head. I didn't take notes, but I'll do the best I can. So she started off, I asked her, how are things going right now in her city? And she said that things are going better. It's the coldest part of the year is over, and so the weather is better, and the electricity is more reliable than it was before. She says sometimes it'll be off for 3 hours, which is a lot better than off for 20 hours. Her heating bills were terrible because she relied on electricity, and but at least she managed. She, as I mentioned in one of my recent posts, she lives in a Khrushchevka, which is one of these small apartments. They're about 40 to 60 meters, probably square meters. We're talking about, maybe let's multiply. It's about 500 square feet, something like that. So it's a small place, but it's livable. And as I mentioned, I have I have one Russian friend in Moscow. So here's this woman, she lives in Ukraine, and she's living in a Khrushchevka. And I have another friend who's a Zen person, like me. We practice Zen meditation, so we have something in common there. And he lives in a Khrushchevka, small apartment with his 2 kids. And I have another friend, an American friend, and he lives with his wife, his Russian wife, and he lives in a Khrushchevka. So I asked my friend, well, how's it going with your new apartment? She said, oh, it's really, really nice. And she's very, very happy there. She said that these Khrushchevkas they're like these apartment blocks of 5-story buildings, and there's a number of them, and there's like a common area. And she put some money she bought this place probably for dirt cheap, and she fixed it up. It took maybe 2 years to do it, but she finally got it fixed up. And she says the common area, that is, if you look at, I sent a video of Khrushchevka in Moscow. I think it's some city in Russia. And there's a common area where there's basically a playground. Kids can play, and the parents can look out the window and watch their kids playing, and it all works, quite well. It's not sumptuous, but it works, Anyway, so she says the common area is a mess, but when the weather gets better, she's going to go out there and clean it up. So that was nice. And she said something very, very interesting. I said, so how's it going? What's the sentiment there in Ukraine right now? And she said, before, there was a lot more sentiment about, defending the country and so on and so forth. And she said, but look, BlackRock has bought all the land in Western Ukraine, and people are saying, we're fighting Russia for the benefit of BlackRock. They occupy our country, and we're fighting the war for them against Russia. So what's that all about? So that doesn't make any sense. And they're kind of some people at least are waking up to that. And so she told me that she said that, she has to be very careful, because people's emotions are very strong about all these issues. And so she said that the workman who was like the foreman of the crew, would sometimes drive her from one place to another because she doesn't have a car. And she said that she was hesitant to even get him into a discussion about these things, because it can be dangerous. If you say stuff that doesn't accord with the government, line, you could get a visit from the secret police and get hauled off, and be never heard from again. It's really that bad. But anyway, so he was talking, and he said, now I understand why Vladimir Putin, is doing what he's doing. It's because we Ukrainians are just plain obnoxious. And who wants a neighbor who hates your guts? That won't work. And he kind of understands that this whole, cooked up hatred towards Russia is it's not doing Ukraine any good. So then she talked about her friend. And she has a good friend who she's known for at least 20 years or so. And her friend came from a village, a kind of a small village outside of a city. My friend grew up in a bigger city, And my friend speaks Russian fluently. She's culturally and ethnically Russian. Her friend came from one of these smaller villages where the Ukrainian dialect is spoken, and um, and they have had a long term, kind of multi generational feeling that they're kind of inferior to the Russian, the people who speak Russian as their first language as opposed to Ukrainian, and Ukrainian is a kind of a mishmash of Polish and Russian and other dialects, and it all kind of fits together. Actually, Ukrainian was essentially kind of formalized during the Soviet Union. They made it into a viable language. It was just kind of people just talking. It was kind of like maybe, I don't know, the equivalent of Ebonics or something. When you look at people who live in these extremely poverty-stricken areas of the United States, they are culturally not the same as New Yorkers or people from San Francisco or even people from Atlanta, Georgia, or Austin, Texas. The people in those cities are far better educated. They're far more worldly. They understand things from a much wider point of view than somebody from some country hick, that lives in some backwater in Mississippi or something. And so, and Ukraine has the equivalent of that, of people living in those kinds of villages. So, and they have this kind of, inferiority complex, which is maybe magnified by people like Hillary Clinton, who calls them the deplorables. And so they have this kind of innate hatred towards it's like the country hicks versus the city slickers. So it's kind of like that. And she said to me, what happened was the West weaponized the decades-long sense of inferiority that these Ukrainians had towards the more cultured city and Russian-speaking people. So I thought that was a very interesting point, which I wanted to bring to your attention. And as I pointed out in another context, that when the United States they cultivated Al Qaeda. I don't know if you know this, but the textbooks that were used in the quote unquote madrasas, the religious schools, they were written basically according to the CIA guidelines in Nebraska. They were printed in Nebraska and then distributed to people living in Afghanistan, and filling their heads up with this crap, this anti-modern crap and anti-Soviet crap. That was what went on during the time when the Soviet Union was trying to help out the Afghan government develop a modern country, where women didn't have to wear special clothing, and they could get educated as university education, which was not allowed to them because of these backward people in the back country. And it happens in just about every country. You have this kind of modern civilization, and you have these backwater people. In the case of Afghanistan, or in the case of the United States, with these country hicks, so to speak, or you have these people in Ukraine. And the United States, just as they weaponized the ignorant people in semi-literate or illiterate people in Afghanistan, they also and they weaponized them. They weaponized them in the United States, to hate the African Americans, because they think they're living in poverty themselves, but they consider themselves superior because the white upper class, the white manipulators, weaponize their sense of inferiority. And that's exactly what happened in Ukraine. And it got manifested by this guy named Stefan Bandera and some of his cronies, and has created this terrible civil war, which never should have happened, but it was because of the United States. And then I mentioned that one of the issues why a lot of younger Russians, have these anti-Russian feelings against the government in Russia I meet a number of them here in Chiang Mai, and so I was looking into what is it, what changed their consciousness, and I've met a number of Russians who are like this, and it turns out that the during the Soviet Union, people got a really excellent education. They're extremely well read, even if they are scientists or engineers. This guy Andrei Martyanov, who's a career naval officer in the Soviet Navy. He came to the United States when the Soviet Union fell apart because he was getting death threats for just simply being in the military. But he had an excellent education, and he's not just as a math and physics and engineering type of person, but as a literary person. They actually read stuff. They read stuff that even I haven't read. Western literature. So so they had a very strong educational system. But what happened was that when the Soviet Union fell apart, it fell into a deep sense of inferiority, that it had kind of failed. And not everybody, but a lot of people felt that way. And so they said, we need to revamp the Soviet education system. So it changed from a ideological education system to inculcate Marxism and socialist and communist ideas in the students. It became a non-ideological education of objective history. So I asked my AI, chat mentor, where did they get this quote unquote objective history? And it turns out that the curriculum was created in the United States by organizations such as the Atlantic Council. So then I say, well, but where do they get their history from? Where's the history actually come from? Say, well, they get their funding from the U.S. State Department, the British Foreign Office, the National Endowment for Democracy. And so you see where this is going. What they did was they took a bunch of distortions and flat out lies and published it as the real history of Russia and the Soviet Union, and filled people's heads up with this. And as a result, I've met many of these people. They're really wonderful people, very intelligent, but they were essentially brainwashed with Western propaganda. It's a terribly unfortunate situation. Getting back to the discussion that I had with my friend, so she was talking with her friend, who was she came from one of these villages, and they've been friends for a long time. But she said in the course of, and this woman is living in France. She married a French person, a French guy, and moved to France. And my friend, here in the whom I met in Chiang Mai, she went back to Ukraine because she wants to take care of her mother, who's an older woman. So she said, we usually don't talk about these things, but yesterday we just had it was really tough, because she said something about, criticizing Russia or whatever it was. And my friend said, what are you talking about? Don't you understand what happened? You've been filled up with all this Bandera bullshit that was going on before the 2014 coup. The United States was doing to the Ukrainian population what the American elite does to the poor white population, encouraging them to have hatred towards, the either the African Americans or hatred towards the pointy-headed intellectuals. That is, people who are getting a better education in the larger cities. So this is how this is how elites, especially in the West, divide and conquer. They divide and rule by creating these splits between using class war, class consciousness, or lack thereof, to create splits in the society as a way to control it. So I thought that was extremely interesting, and I wanted to bring that to your attention. The last thing she said, which was quite disturbing, but it kind of, it's one more data point, you could say, which is not exactly corroborated, but there are too many of these rumors to just dismiss. And so she was on social media, and she said that this woman got the body of her husband back. The husband had been killed in combat. She saw the body, and she said that it wasn't her husband's body, it was her husband's face, it was her husband's head, but there were body parts attached together to create what looked like a body. And we know that we hear persistent reports of, let's say, a Ukrainian soldier. He's at the front, he's wounded, and rather than trying to save his life, there are transplant surgeons near the battlefield. They'll take these guys to the battlefield, extract their organs for sale, and dispose of the body in whatever way they dispose of it, and send it back to the person. Half their organs are removed, and other body parts attached. So I cannot corroborate that. I can't give direct evidence of that, but this is just one report from a woman on social media in Ukraine who said that this is what happened. So, and there is just too many of these reports. It's the kind of thing that, with the Epstein situation, people heard about Pizzagate, and they heard about these rumors about this. And there was the Franklin scandal back in the 1980s with the George H.W. Bush administration, where they were bringing boys in from Boys Town and using them for, sexual exploitation. So you hear these stories about the nature of these upper class people and just how depraved they are. And it looks like this is what's happening in Ukraine as well. So I guess that's pretty much all I have to say. I just wanted to report on some of the things that my friend and I were talking about, because as I finished off with, as we were discussing all this, I said, you can get reports from CNN or BBC or, all of these news outlets, or even Facebook or whatever you want to get. But as I said to her, I know you. You've been my friend for 2 years. We've talked for hours about all kinds of issues, and I trust you. So when she tells me the situation as it is from her point of view, and she tells me that the people in Ukraine, after having initially bought the line about what was going on and demonizing Russia, are realizing that no, it's actually, their leadership that is completely corrupt and has taken them down this tragic path. And so many of them have changed their views on it. And I said, so where's it all going? She says, I really don't know. It's very hard to say how things will turn out for Ukraine. We don't know how long the battles will go on, or how much of Ukraine the Russian Federation will reclaim as Russian-speaking areas and culturally Russian areas. We just don't know. But it was very useful for me to hear what she had to say. So that's and we talk, periodically. So I thought I'll just close it out from here. Thanks again for listening to my report here. It's as you can see, it's basically kind of off the cuff based on my conversation. I just got off the phone with her like 20 minutes ago. So thanks again for listening, and I will catch you again soon. And please, be sure to support my channel by giving me a like or a share or a comment. Thanks again for listening, and I'll catch you quite soon.